You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, everyone, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're getting back to opinion scholarship. It's been a little while. Apologies all. The last time I did a solo episode like this, it may have been like 7-8 weeks ago. It's been a long time. There's a reason for that. I've been busy, and there's holiday season and all that. Also, the book that I read for this episode is a doozy. Like, it's a bit of a doozy. So, there was 3 different authors in this book, all Neoplatonists. And as much of a fan as I am of Plato, never really got into the Neoplatonists, and so this was my foray into learning about it. So without further ado, I want to get into this. I called this episode From Monism to Monotheism, Plotinus and Company. So we're going to talk about more than just Plotinus, but he's sort of who everyone thinks of when they think of Neoplatonism. He's the founder of Neoplatonism. And the reason this sort of fell onto my radar most recently is because as I was reading through the pre-Socratic philosophers, and we did a bunch of episodes on those, I was a little bit surprised to learn that in this polytheistic world of ancient Greece, surrounded by other polytheistic tribes and nations all around them that they're interacting with, that you'd end up with these pre-Socratic philosophers talking about God in a different way, and not even using the word God because it didn't really make sense to them in the context of polytheism. But these pre-Socratics like Heraclitus and Pythagoras and some of these people were speaking about this monad, this oneness, this wholeness, in a way that reminded me of like Carl Jung and also monotheism. It also reminded me of the religion that I was raised in, Christianity, and all the other monotheist religions. This idea of monism, which these pre-Socratic Greeks seem to hold, and also Plato seemed to hold, sort of continue with the Neoplatonists all the way into the Christian era. And it was really kind of surprising to me that I hadn't encountered this. And I'm realizing only now that the Gospel of John is so explicitly Greek, and Christianity developed in the Greek world. And so there must be some kind of backdrop for a polytheistic system that had existed forever to lose traction to this new monotheism that's seemingly coming from the Levant into Greece. Like, what are the odds? Unless there was already a foundation ready and waiting for Christianity to sort of capitalize on. And if you have no idea what I mean, let me just say, as concisely as I can, Christianity shares with Neoplatonism a couple of things. The belief in a transcendent realm, right? So a Christian would call that heaven, but Plato would call that the world of forms, a transcendent realm, right? There's the ordinary physical world, and there's something like a spiritual realm, right? Christians believe that. The Neoplatonists believe that. We also both believe in a transcendent source of all things. Christians or Jews would call that God Most High, El Elyon, right? God Most High. The Neoplatonists call it the good or the one. More the one than the good. Plato himself called it the good or the form of the good and was seeking after an understanding of that. And I'll pump the brakes for a second because we'll get into that. But also, both Christianity and Neoplatonism, they believed in a host of sort of supernatural powers that exist from and are subordinate to this thing, God or the one. In Christianity, we call those things spirits, angels, demons, and so forth. The Neoplatonists called them gods with a lowercase g, the Olympians, but also daemons, these sort of personal spirits and sort of these sort of numinous ideas. And then on top of that, both, and this is partly why I brought up the Gospel of John, but both Christianity and Neoplatonists hold this idea of logos as central. And it's associated with the divine in both cases. So you have like a tremendous amount of overlap between Christian beliefs and Neoplatonism. And so I think that this provided fertile soil for Christianity to take root in the Greco-Roman world, because we had this sort of little known but pervasive, under the surface ideas of the monad, the one, the good, as Plato would say. And so that book I showed you a minute ago is really a classical translation. I think it was the first, actually, into English of these ancient Greek texts, Neoplatonist texts. The person who translated it is named Thomas Taylor. He's very famous for translating these classical works. And so this would have been in the 1800s, roundabout. And the books that we're going to look at today are Plotinus's work called the Enneads. I believe his student Porphyry actually put it together, but it's attributed to Plotinus. And then you have Porphyry, I just mentioned, in a work called Auxiliaries to the Perception of Intelligible Natures. So that's a bit of a mouthful. And then also this fellow named Proclus, who wrote a book called Elements of Theology. So I'm going to focus on Plotinus because he's kind of the main guy, but I want to sprinkle in some Porphyry and Proclus so you get really the major figures of Neoplatonism. And before I kind of get rolling, let me give you a little bit of a historical backdrop just so you understand the timing that we're dealing with. So when we're talking about Neoplatonism, we're talking about a resurgence in the ideas that were originally founded by Plato and the academy that he founded in Athens, so that we're teaching this philosophy. For those of you who don't remember, Plato lived right around 428 BC to 348 BC. And he spoke about this idea of, a quest for three things. And you've probably heard this before: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the idea is Plato was concerned with essences, forms he called them. He was concerned with what makes something good, good, right? There must be an essence, there must be something in common with these things we call good. But he began to relate the good, this idea of the good, but also the idea of the true and the beautiful as kind of like three aspects or three paths to the same answer. It's leading you to the same place, and that place is what a modern Christian would call God. But remember, Plato and the pre-Socratics had different ideas of what the word God means, and so this idea of the good or the form of the good was elusive and very difficult to Plato really struggled with this idea, and we'll see that. But we really have to fast forward 500 years from Plato to get to the Neoplatonics, beginning with Plotinus. So we're jumping from Plato's death in 348 BC to Plotinus in the early 200s AD. So he lived from 204 to 270. He was the founder of Neoplatonism, born in Egypt, lived in Rome. That's Plotinus. His student, directly under him, was Porphyry, another famous Neoplatonist who lived from 234 to 305 AD. And then we kind of jump forward in time a little bit to get to Proclus because we don't see him until he lived 412 to 485 AD. So we jump like 100 years ahead to get to Proclus. The reason why we need to include Proclus is because he did things a little differently than Porphyry and Plotinus. He's going to come across, we're not going to get into him in detail because it's difficult and it just not fitting for this particular way of communicating, but Proclus reminds me a lot of Spinoza. Now, Thomas Taylor suggests that he reminds him of Euclid. And if you know about Euclid, he wrote these, the rules of geometry, essentially. And he wrote them in these very logical and mathematical ways where everything sort of builds on you accept the premise and they just sort of continue to build on to each other until you have this sort of fully fleshed out system of geometry. And Proclus does this with ontology. He does this with, you'll see when we get there. But Proclus, he's from Constantinople, and he actually moved to Athens, and he founded a new academy, right? Plato had the original academy, 300s BC, and Proclus moves back to Athens and starts a new one. So you might call Proclus's academy the Neoplatonics, something like that. All right, so that's enough kind of leading up to, let's just get in. We have a lot to cover. So where I want to begin and how I want to frame this is that there was an idea of God that existed in the ancient Greek world that they hid under the rug. I don't know how intentional it was. I don't know if it's because it conflicted with their kind of religious orthodoxy, if it was like an idea that was only tossed around among the intellectuals in these philosophical circles, and, you know, it just wasn't a mainstream popular idea. I really don't know. But I want to call this section the idea of God, Greek religion hid under the rug. And I want to ask you to consider something, because this is what I was doing when I was thinking about this. Have you ever considered how different the worldview is for a pagan polytheist versus a monotheist? Like, how different must it be, the way that you see the world? I grew up in this monotheistic Christian context. It has a huge influence on the way I see the world, the way I understand morality, the way I think about ontology, the ideas that I allow myself to explore about the supernatural, and all of that stuff is bounded by this monotheistic upbringing. It's like, how different would that be if you grew up in a different way? If your parents believed in many gods, and their parents, and their parents, and their parents, and everyone around you, and everywhere you travel, everyone thinks the same, that the world is filled and imbued by these supernatural forces that are autonomous, you know? So a polytheist is going to look at the world as something that includes these autonomous supernatural forces, where monotheists are going to think about the world and all of its forces, supernatural and otherwise, all of it, emanating from a single supernatural principle. It's very, very different. The idea of God in those contexts, it's almost hard to imagine they're anything alike. Like, imagine that you bump into this, you know, you just plop yourself into the ancient world and you bump into an ancient pagan commoner, and you're trying to explain to them what you mean by God with a capital G. I can just imagine the pagan commoner saying, "Oh, you mean the king of the gods?" No, that's not what I mean. "Oh, you mean the most powerful of the gods?" No, that's not what I mean. "Oh, the very first of the gods?" Still no, right? No, there's something entirely different in kind between the Olympian gods, the gods with lowercase g's, right, that they believed in the ancient Greek world, versus the monotheistic God with a capital G. These beings are different in kind. And what I want to do now is I want to give you some of the descriptions. Like, imagine you were trying to describe this idea of a monotheistic God, a God with a capital G. The way that they describe it, or try to describe it, or put a name to it, or put it into a category, it's really like illuminating in how they thought about it. And it kind of illustrates this struggle of trying to come to understand this thing that's very difficult for them to understand, like a new idea. Really, it's a novel new idea. And Plotinus calls this, when he tries to explain this idea of God with a capital G, he calls it the soul of the world. The soul of the world. He also calls it the supreme divinity. Right? And like Plato, he calls it the good itself. Now, apart from calling it the supreme divinity, he also calls it the supreme intellect. He calls it the highest God, the God above all the gods. The God from which the other gods flow. And of course, he calls it the One. Porphyry, his student, called it that God who is beyond all things. Right? The polytheistic world filled with your polytheistic gods. They're kind of immanent, right? They're around you. They're in control over representing forces of nature, or in control over representing psychological forces within you. Those gods, you know, Hermes and Mars and Eros and all these things, they're around. The God that we're talking about, Porphyry says, is the God who is beyond all things. And then Proclus, he calls it the monad, the one. It's just another way of talking about the one. And what I like to do here is I like to think about, it just reminds me of my own process of trying to understand something difficult or something kind of beyond the pale or beyond ordinary understanding. When I think about these ideas that have to do with God and being and ontology, this is the process I go through. I try to think, okay, these are all the things that this thing I can't think of must be. So I have this sort of imaginative exercise where I'm thinking to myself, what is it then that could be all of these things? And that process is it's like beating your head against the wall, but it does work. If you put the effort in, it does seem to work. And it reminds me of this sort of depth psychology sort of thing that I got from Jung. Free association, kind of like that Freudian sort of idea. I usually say that there is a cloud of associations. In my mind, there's words and ideas and concepts and connections that I can build and build and build until I start to see patterns, and they start to kind of come together. And then I can make sense of something that previously I couldn't understand at all. And this is what I see the Neoplatonists doing towards this idea of God as the ultimate, as the monotheistic idea of God. So think about all these descriptions that I just gave you. The soul of the world, the supreme intellect. I forgot one. This is a good one. The first genera of things. Right? Right? The category before there's any categories, right? The first genera of things. This is that word genus, like we think about genus species. Imagine the genus. That's the very first one from which all the other categories can be defined and from which they come. He's that too. The highest God, the one, the God who is beyond all things, the good, right? The supreme intellect. This is a cloud of associations. And it's a telltale sign of a numinous, mostly unconscious idea trying to make itself comprehensible. A way of trying to understand something beyond your understanding. What is that thing which could be described in all of these ways? And Plato struggled with this idea. He's seeking the essence behind all goodness, what he called the form of the good. And this was Plato's attempt to reach this idea of God with a capital G. And I want to give it to you because I don't want you to take my word for it. Plato wrote these dialogues, lots of them. One of them is called Alcibiades. And in Alcibiades, remember this is in the 400s BC, Plato says this. Listen to this. All things are the progeny of one fire, one divine nature. The monad is there first and is extended, which generates two. So if you don't remember the pre-Socratics, the episodes we did on them, you may have forgotten about old Heraclitus. Old Heraclitus who tried to suggest that the arche, the simplest component of existence, I believe he called it, I'm going to butcher this, the Greek, I believe he called it zagoon, something like that. It meant ever-living fire. This is what Heraclitus believed was the source of reality. Something he called ever-living fire. Right? That's another association that we can throw in the mix and try to understand, get a better idea of what we're trying to get to here. So when Plato says all things are the progeny of one fire, one divine nature, I see this as a callback to Heraclitus. But the key word here is one. Plato says everything is the children of, everything is birthed from one fire, one divine nature. The monad is there, the one thing. And it says that one thing is then extended to become two, to generate the multiplicity of the world. But it all rolls back and begins with a single thing. Now I want to read you a quote from Hippolytus of Rome, bishop of Rome, so Christian era. He was a contemporary of Plotinus, so I wanted to drop this quote on you, but he's actually talking about Pythagoras, who lived 100 years before Plato. And just listen to how he puts this. He says, Pythagoras declared that the unbegotten monad was the principle of the universals, the father of the dyad, and the mother of all engendered things. So you see that fertile soil that even was there before the time of Plato, before Plato started, inquiring into what the form of the good might be. Pythagoras said that there is an unbegotten monad, right? That is an unborn eternal oneness, wholeness, unity. And that thing is the principle of the universals. Well, that those universals are what Plato is going to call forms. It's the source of the forms that make up the multiplicity of the world. And just like Plato says the monad is first, it gets extended and to generate the multiplicity of the world. The same thing you hear in Pythagoras. He says the monad is the father of the dyad, that's the two, and the mother of all things. From one you get two, and then you get many. This is the idea of how the multiplicity of the world comes about. It comes from one thing originally. Comes from a seed. It comes from an egg, right? We're very familiar with this in nature. It's repeated everywhere, fractally, everywhere you look. And this brings me to Plotinus. Now, I want to give you a description that Plotinus gives of what he calls the good. This is, coming back from Plato's idea of the good as God with a capital G. And I want you to listen to how different this description is from any description you might expect about an Olympian god. If they were going to describe Zeus or Hera or, Mars or, any of the Greek gods, or I was dropping Greek and Roman names there interchangeably, but any god that you might try to describe, think about how this compares. Listen, put your monotheistic ears on and listen to this description. He says, the good is that sublime principle from which all things depend and derive their origin. Good itself is in want of nothing, but is perfectly sufficient to itself. It is the measure and bound of all things, from its self-producing intellect, essence, soul, and life. The supreme intellect of which we are now speaking is itself all things, dwells ever with itself, is perfectly united to itself, and without possession possesses all things. For it does not possess these as different from itself, nor is one particular separated from another, but everything there is a whole, and everywhere all, yet in such a manner that particulars preserve a distinction as they are beheld. All things are in regular subordination about the King of the universe, who is the cause of everything good, and for whose sake all things subsist. Boy, oh boy. You see what I mean? That's a description of God that you could imagine was written by Thomas Aquinas or something. It sounds like a description of a monotheistic God. And you can see it, they're not even using the word God because it doesn't make sense for them to do it. They already have an idea of gods, and this is not that. See, this is the good. This is something else. And you might think it was just some sort of moral component. Are we talking about good versus evil? Or what are we talking about here? No, it's very clear. The good is something ontological. The good is that sublime principle from which all things depend and derive their origin. All things come from the good and are sustained in their existence by the good. The good is in want of nothing. It's perfectly sufficient to itself. It doesn't need anything for its existence. And yet it's the measure and bound of all other things. It needs nothing for its existence, but everything else needs it for their existence. And then there's some really interesting stuff here. I mean, he does call the good the supreme intellect, which I think is interesting. But listen to this thing. He says, It does not possess, it possesses all things. And then it says it doesn't possess these as different from itself. So this is, you want to kind of hone your ears on this. This is the unity and the oneness we're talking about. It possesses all things, but not as different from itself. Nor is one particular separated from another. In God, all things are one. That's what he's trying to say. And all the mystics in the audience know what he means by that. He says, but everything there is a whole, and everywhere all. And then listen to this. Yet in such a manner that particulars preserve a distinction as they are beheld. Okay, now pump the brakes for a second. I don't know if you remember, if we can hearken back to some of these episodes that I did on quantum mechanics and its connections to ontology, because I love that subject. Here we have something like this. Imagine God as the oneness, as the unity of all things. All the things that exist within God. Something like that. They're all one thing. He says, but all of these particular things that exist in God, in the unity, it says that those particulars preserve a distinction as they are beheld, as they are observed, as they are experienced. And you get this idea that sounds a lot like a wave function collapse from quantum mechanics. It's like all things, all the multiplicity of the world, all the particular things that exist, they exist within God. All together is one thing, because God is one thing. But when you observe them, they still exist in their particular way, not as some sort of blended together homogeneous oneness. They still have their particular existence, but that particular existence isn't evoked unless it's beheld, right? This is the wave function collapse. This is the double slit experiment. As soon as you observe the wave, it turns into a particle. As soon as you observe the oneness of God, then the multiplicity of the world is there, right? And there's this connection here between beholding the one and the act of beholding, turning that oneness or revealing that the oneness is made of particular things into the multiplicity of the world. And observation is the trigger, just like wave function collapse, just like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. And we get that from Plotinus. Very, very strange. All right, that leads me to the next section, which I'm going to call mystical experience. And I want to start with this because I believe that Plotinus, just like the pre-Socratics, and all the other, I could throw in lots of other categories there, the Advaita Vedanta school and Hinduism and, the Zoroastrians and even the monotheistic face of the world, I could throw them all into that category. I believe this idea of oneness and the significance of unity and this divine cosmic idea of unity comes from a particular type of human experience that I call mystical experience. Many people call it many names. I always like to say that the hippies will call this one with the universe feeling. Usually it's drug related, but lots of people describe this experience of becoming united with the cosmos, the universe, with consciousness, with God, all of these sorts of things. And I think this insistence on this monad or the one comes from the mystical experience and is identical to the insistence of the Jews and the Christians that God is one. So I want to start with references from Plotinus that show very clearly that he had this sort of a mystical experience. And perhaps all of the Platonists and Neoplatonists and Middle Platonists did. We know, of course, that the Eleusinian mysteries were involved during the time of Plato. Plato participated in them. They involved psychedelic drug use, out-of-body experience, ego death sorts of things. These sorts of things that always are associated with these sorts of mystical experiences. So let me show you first all of these connections to mystical experience from Plotinus, and then I'm going to show you what I believe are the post hoc rationalizations. After you have this sort of experience, how you then explain it to yourself to make it make sense. That's what I think is going on here, so that's what I'm going to try to lay out. All right, this section is called Mystical Experience. Plotinus says, "This is manifested by the mandate of the mysteries, which orders that they shall not be divulged to those who are uninitiated. For as that which is divine cannot be unfolded to the multitude, this mandate forbids the attempt to elucidate it to anyone but him who is fortunately able to perceive it. Therefore, in this conjunction with deity, there were not two things, but the perceiver was one with the thing perceived, as not being, properly speaking, vision, but union." All right, the hair stands up on my arms. So there's a lot here in this small paragraph, so let's dive in. So first of all, he brings up the mysteries, and I want to point out he's referring there to the Eleusinian mysteries. He's referring to these ancient mystery religions and schools in ancient Greece, like the Orphics, all of these schools and ideas involve this concept of dying and being reborn, or going to the underworld and coming back, of having this sort of ego death or real death or simulated death experience, and coming back from that experience with something that you didn't have before, something powerful and something important, something that the early Christians would probably call gnosis, some truth about reality and the divine that you now know that you didn't before. So he immediately brings this up and talks about, the people who are uninitiated are not able to even hear about this stuff being discussed, which was true. I mean, the mystery schools were kept secret like that. Then he says, "For as that which is divine cannot be unfolded to the multitude," right? He's saying you can't get up on a soapbox and tell people about this, because it's only going to be words. What this is a personal inner experience, right? I can tell you about that all day long. It's not going to give you that experience. You have to have the experience for yourself. All of this should be ringing bells here of mystical experience. And then he says it very explicitly. He says, "Therefore, in this conjunction with deity," see, this is what the mysteries offer you. A conjunction with deity, a union with God. He says, "There were not two things, but the perceiver was one with the thing perceived." So I had this encounter with God, and it's not so much like an encounter with God. I'm not looking at him and shaking his hand. It is, and he says so. He says, not being properly speaking vision, but union, right? I have a union with God. And so I now know God, not because I encountered him somehow in the third person, but because I was him, because I became him, because I was unified with him. Conjunction with the deity. This is something like knowing by being, knowing through experience. He goes on, he says, "Soul may receive, and through intellect survey the one, not employing any one of the senses, but with a pure intellect, beholding that which is most pure." So here he's telling you that this sort of a conjunction with deity is possible. He says, the soul may receive, and through intellect survey the one. The soul may encounter God, is what he's saying. Not through your senses, but through your intellect. And so this is important because he calls God a pure intellect. So there's a connection between ourselves as possessing an intellect and God as being intellect. And that similitude, as Plotinus would say, is what allows us to know God. A Christian would just say, well, that thing in you that you call your soul or spirit, that thing that makes you alive and conscious and aware, that thing is God. This is really the same. We're talking apples and apples here, right? In Genesis, the Spirit of God is breathed into Adam. God is there in Adam. And the Neoplatonic point of view, it's not soul so much, although that is part of the mix. It's just not understood exactly the same way, but intellect. And remember, intellect is something numinous. It's not physical. It's not material. What is intellect? What is consciousness? What's the difference between consciousness and spirit, right? See what I mean? Plotinus says, just as if someone having entered into the interior of the adytum should leave behind all the statues in the temple after the inward spectacle, the thing itself which the images represent. Perhaps this was not a spectacle, but another mode of vision or ecstasy, and an expansion and ascension of himself, and a striving after conjunction, in order to behold what the adytum contains. All right, I'm going to stop here. There's more, but I want to stop here because I don't know that everyone knows what an adytum is. I certainly didn't before I started reading this. That word really just means like the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, a place where normal people aren't allowed to go. So this was true, of course, in the temple in Jerusalem, but it's also true of all the temples in the ancient world, that there is a central place in that temple where normal people can't go, that's set aside as particularly holy, as set aside as a place where the God resides. And so I'll continue this. He says, if he has not entered, he will conceive the adytum to be a certain invisible thing, and will have knowledge of the fountain and principle of things. But when situated there, he will see the principle and can be conjoined with it. That which remains to him who is passed beyond all things is that which is prior to all things. To be in itself alone and not in being is to be in God, for God is something which is beyond essence. All right, so we're going to break this one down because this was longer. Okay, so what he's describing here is going into a temple, the place where the statues of the gods are, and you have this sort of on the surface, vision of these representations of the gods and all the stuff that you'd expect in this temple. But he said, but when you leave the statues behind, when you go further, when you go beyond the representation of the god, and you're seeking after what he calls the thing itself, right? That which those images represent. When you're not satisfied looking at the representations of the god, the statue, and you want to actually experience what that statue represents, then you go into the Holy of Holies. And he said, there you encounter a spectacle. And he said, but maybe it's not a spectacle. Maybe it's another mode of vision or ecstasy. And then he calls it an expansion and accession of himself. And I can't help but think of people in this vein that talk about expanding consciousness. These sort of mystical experiences are often described as an expansion of consciousness. So my consciousness is something that seems to be limited to my body, but I might have an experience where that feeling of my body, the limits of myself, are expanded to include others, or they're expanded all the way to include the cosmos and everything. That is the sort of mystical experience in a nutshell. And this is what he says. He says it's not a spectacle you're observing in the Holy of Holies when you're there in the presence of the real thing. It's a vision and an ecstasy that's an expansion and accession of himself and a striving after conjunction, union with God, right? Conjunction. He says in order to behold what the adytum contains, right? In order to behold what's in the Holy of Holies, you have to have a conjunction. You have to have an experience. You have to become the thing. That's the only way to know the thing. He says, if he has not entered, right, if he has not gone into the Holy of Holies or gone into his own essence, looking within, if you haven't done that, right, your body's the temple, right? You want to go to the Holy of Holies, you go within. If you don't do that, you will conceive the adytum to be a certain invisible thing and will have knowledge of the fountain and principle of things. But only when you're situated there will you see the principle and be conjoined with it. There's a difference between knowing something intellectually and experiencing something as a personal inner experience. There's something different about reading a holy book and having a religious experience. You see the distinction. And then he says, that which remains to him who has passed beyond all things is that which is prior to all things. And I can't help but think about something like if you've had an ego death, which is, again, something associated with these mystical experiences. You come outside yourself, you die to yourself, and in doing so realize that you're not dead. There's something more to you than your ego or your body. Right? And that's the trick. That's the gnosis. That's the information not everybody has. So that which remains to him who has passed beyond all things sounds like that which remains after the ego death. The eternal I, the subject, the knower, the thing that remains there after quote unquote you are gone. All the things you attach yourself to, your face, your memories, your name, the sound of your voice, all these things, the things you love, your interests, your values, when all that goes away, it's not nothing. There's something left. There's something that still feels like what you mean by when you say I. There's still the subject, the knower. And that thing is the divine thing. To be in itself alone, he says, and not in being. Right? To be dead, for all intents and purposes, is to be in God. For God is something which is beyond essence. Next, he says, by taking away being, you are able to apprehend this ineffable nature. What does he mean by taking away being? Again, I think of an ego death scenario here. By taking away being, by taking away what it is you think you are, or what it is you think you're existing in, right? When all of this goes, your understanding of yourself and reality around you, when all of that goes, then you're able to apprehend this ineffable nature, right? Then you're in God and are God. He says, listen to this. He says, you will immediately be filled with astonishment and directing yourself towards him till you repose in his solitary deity. You will now behold him by a vision perfectly simple and one. So this union with God, this feeling is one of astonishment. And it results in you reposing, resting in the solitary deity, the oneness. And this is a vision that he says is perfectly one. So I ask, how is a vision one? What does that mean? By unifying the perceiver and the thing perceived, the knower and the known, the subject and the object, or you might say in a religious way, creator and creation. To be in conjunction. That's a vision perfectly one. An experience of being perfectly one. Couple more, he says, the perception of the highest God is a mode of knowledge superior to that of science. The soul is not entirely one when it receives scientific knowledge. For science is reason, and reason is multitudinous. The soul, therefore, deviates from the one and falls into number and multitude. So this is interesting, right? He's saying, the perception of the highest God is a mode of knowledge that's superior to that of science because it unifies everything. It leaves nothing out. He says, when the soul receives scientific knowledge, it automatically has to break itself off from the object of its knowledge. Right? You must be a subject learning about an object. So you've in order for you to have scientific knowledge, you've removed that unity. That unity that's there and ultimately important, you have to ignore that. You can't even have scientific knowledge. You can't have a subject and an object, to experience, because everything's one, right? This is why he says that this mystical experience is knowledge superior to that of science. Find that interesting. But then he says that science is reason and reason is multitudinous, right? He's saying that's many, and that kind of avoids confrontation with the one, doesn't it? He says the soul therefore deviates from the one and falls into number and multitude. The soul deviates from the one and falls into number and multitude. What does that mean? It seems like what he's saying is that the multiplicity of the world, all of the things that are out there in the space and time and physics, laws of physics, and all different people and other consciousnesses and all the stuff that we think about when we think about reality, that all of that stuff is representational, like the temples, like the idols in the temples are. They're not the thing itself, they're representational. Right? So learn about the representations all you want. Take your science as far as it goes. Learn about the representations, but know that you're not learning about the thing itself. You're learning about its representations. And I think this is still a valid criticism of science. Now, I'm not anti-science. I love science. We were just talking about quantum physics a minute ago. But this criticism that science ignores the subject of knowledge, that it ignores consciousness, that's perfectly valid. That is still true today as it was during the time of Aristotle. It's still true today. Science wants to study what reality is apart from and outside of our perception of it. It wants to know what's really real behind our perceptions. And to do that, it has to ignore the fact that we're perceiving. It has to ignore the fact that in order to get to those things that are real, we get to them through consciousness. Nope, it doesn't want to know about consciousness. It wants to know about the things behind it. Okay? And then lastly, I want to bring up Porphyry into this conversation, Plotinus' student, who said this. He said, if you investigate being established in yourself and your own essence, you will be assimilated to the intelligible universe. Of such great consequence is it for man to be present with that which is present with him. For those who are able to proceed into their own essence will recover themselves through the union of that which knows with that which is known. That which is able to know itself without the subject in which it exists, and is able to withdraw itself from this subject without the destruction of itself, knowing itself by its own energies. All right, so there's just like all of these statements, there's just depths to explore here. But I want to point out the first thing that he says. He says, if you investigate being established in yourself and your own essence. Now, the way I would say this is, being is kind of an abstraction here because we understand ourselves to be beings. If you see an animal, you say, that animal's a being, or a plant is a being. We are beings. But he's not talking about a particular being. He said, if you investigate being, right? He's trying to get to the thing that's common in all existing things, right? A human being is a kind of being. What about being itself? See, now that's one level of abstraction up, right? He says, if you investigate being, you will be assimilated to the intelligible universe. And that's Porphyry's way of saying what Plotinus said when he said conjunction with a deity. Assimilation to the intelligible universe. To become one with God, to become one with the universe. And notice how he says, if you investigate being established in yourself, in your essence, right? So what he's saying here is that you seek God, or where God is to be encountered, is within. It's within each of us. And then he says, of such great consequence it is for man to be present with that which is present in him. To know that, as the Christians might say, that the breath of God, that soul of God that was breathed into Adam, that thing that makes you alive and conscious, that thing is you and is God, right? To be present with that which is present with you. And it makes you feel like there's something else living in you, possessing you in a manner of speaking. It's an interesting way to think about it. But to be aware that God is within is to be aware really of what you really are. You're more than just a mortal being, right? You're something else. And he says for those who are able to do this, they'll recover themselves. They'll come to know who they are through the union of that which knows with that which is known, right? That which knows is consciousness, the subject. That which is known is the world or the object, the union of subject and object. And then he says another couple of statements here that are, again, reminiscent of this kind of modern psychological idea of an ego death. He says, that which is able to know itself without the subject. Without the subject, right? What's the subject? The thing I call I. I am the subject of my life, right? To be able to know yourself without the subject in which it exists, right? Apart from the ego, apart from the body, apart from matter, and is able to withdraw itself from this subject, right? To be able to remove yourself from your ego. You see what I mean? To realize that you are more than just your ego, which we all mostly all think that we are. To be able to withdraw yourself from the subject without the destruction of the subject, right? This is not a real death. It's a symbolic one, like the ones you would see in the ancient Greek mystery religions. The Orphic mysteries, the mysteries of Dionysus, all of that. Persephone, to go into the underworld, to die, and to come back. To be born again, as the Christians will say. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call post hoc rationalizations. And again, what I'm saying here is this idea of a cosmic unity comes from mystical experience. There's no doubt in my mind that Plotinus and his cohorts regularly had these experiences. If they didn't, they would never have written the things they did. But once you have an experience like that, then you can't challenge it because it's the most certain about anything you've ever been in your life, first of all. So you have to find a way. You can't brush it off. At least I couldn't. You can't brush it under the rug and never think about it again. Just life is simpler that way. No, that doesn't work. Now what you have to do is rationalize it to yourself. Now what you have to do is make it make sense so that you're not a crazy person thinking crazy things that you can't defend. And this is what the Neoplatonics did. So I'm going to call this section, this first section, Abstraction Seeking Foundation. So when we talk about Plato, we're always talking about forms, and this is a exercise in abstraction. And the idea is, I'm just thinking about how my philosophy professor in first year of college might have described it, but he would say something like, imagine you have a bunch of different dogs displayed in front of you. Some are big, some are small, all the different kinds of dogs. But there is something that's common to them all, something that we call dog. They're all different types of dog, right? So dog is the form of this particular being. So the form is abstracted somehow. And Plato sees the form as something that the manifest dogs are all a model of. This is something like the way Christians talk when they say that man was made in the image of God, the form of God, something like that. And so to Plato, the form is necessary. It has to exist first so that there can be examples of that form that get embodied and manifest in material reality. It's not like a modern person might think that you abstract from the experience of all these dogs something they have in common. It's no. There's something that they have in common must come first. And we know this, from the perspective of biology. There's a certain genetic code that codes for this being we call a dog. That has to come first. There has to be a form that comes first. Now, there might be variations and mutations and all that sort of thing, but the form itself pre-exists the embodied reality. Okay? And so the form provides a foundation for these embodied particular expressions of the form. And that's what I mean here when I say seeking foundation. All right, so let's jump in. Plotinus says, what art or method or study will lead us to the good itself and the first principle of things? What kind of person is it necessary to be who is elevated thither? Right? So he's asking, how do we find God? How do we get to it? How do we know it? And what do I have to be? Like, what kind of person do I have to be to get there? And then he gives a couple of examples that illustrate what I was just trying to illustrate. So let me give them to you. He says the lover, right? This is a certain type of person that you might be. He says the lover is struck by one beautiful body, right? His lover, right? He's struck by the beauty of his lover. The lover is struck by one beautiful body, but he must be led by the exercise of reason to all beautiful bodies, and that which is one and the same in all of them, and inform him that it is derived elsewhere, and is inherent in other things, such as beautiful pursuits and beautiful laws. The lover will now become accustomed to incorporeal natures. So this idea of incorporeal natures is what I was referring to a minute ago when I was talking about forms. This is the idea of some numinous or spiritual reality, a world of forms, as Plato would say, that exists, alongside, and somehow together with this world of manifest reality. The spiritual reality, you might say, as a modern Christian person might. So notice what he's doing. He's like, a lover is going to be, infatuated with or obsessed with or, whatever, the beauty of their lover. And, that at least initially is going to be focused on the physical beauty of the body, right? It's a sexual thing. And once you've recognized something beautiful, remember, Plato links the true and the good and the beautiful. So once you find something beautiful, you must be led to see that thing you're calling beauty exists not just in the body of your lover, but it exists in your own body. It exists in other people's bodies. Then you start seeing beauty everywhere. And you realize that there's something in common among all these beautiful things that you might just call beauty, right? This is the form of something that's being participated in these various bodies, but not just bodies, right? Then you can see that it's not just limited to bodies, that that beauty is to be found elsewhere too. It's to be found in beautiful pursuits and beautiful laws, right? And anything else you might imagine called beautiful. So you're looking for that foundation, for that form of the beautiful. So somebody who's obsessed with beauty can be led down that path. So that's a good starting point. He also says something interesting here. He says that when you are starting to see beauty in other things, and you see that there's this common thing, this form that's common to them all that you're just calling beauty, that you have to realize that thing is derived elsewhere. Okay? Where that form exists, isn't in any of the embodied beings. They're all participating in it. But where is this beauty? Where is the thing that's common to them all that we're calling beauty? Where does it exist? It must, because these are expressions of the form. So where is the damn form? Well, it's not in matter. It's not in the world. It's in the world of forms. It's in, spirit. It's in the numinous. It's in some other part of our reality that we pretend doesn't exist, and we have to be led to and encounter with it. And he even says in another place, Plotinus says, intellect and soul could not be formed from atoms, right? So he's trying to show you that necessarily there is more to the world than the physical and the material. The idea that forms exist, the idea that the soul and the intellect aren't material things and cannot be made from matter. It pushes you on to an understanding that there is more to yourself and more to the world than is immediately obvious to you. And that has to be dealt with. It has to be accounted for. It has to be explored. He says, this is another type of person. He says the philosopher, right? We started talking about the lover. Now he's like, hey, the philosopher must be instructed in the mathematical disciplines in order that he may be accustomed to the perception and belief in incorporeal essence. Remember, he said the same thing about the lover, to be led to this idea of the reality of incorporeal natures, of something more than matter and the physical. And he says that once the philosopher gets their head wrapped around the necessity of the reality of incorporeal essence, then he obtains a knowledge of the first genera of things. Right? It's like if you trace the commonalities of things, like their form, and you keep tracing them back, you will ultimately find a single origin, a single category, a single formless form, right? The first genera of things. So this whole idea of thinking about abstractions and sort of following the forms, that will take you back to the first genera of things. It'll take you back to the origin. That's the thing we're looking for, the good or God. He says, if there are many forms, it is necessary that there should be something common in them, right? Something that makes them all forms. He says the one is without form, being prior to all form. And the implication is that thing that's common to them is this formless unity. The one is the formless thing from which forms can flow. And you have to also see that the search for the commonality, the search for the form, is the search for the oneness, right? It's like I have all these different dogs around me. If I find the thing that's common to them all, it unites them all. They're all dogs, right? So I don't want to go too far down that path, so let me just keep pushing forward. He says, in everything there is a certain one. And I think he means here a certain form in the way I was just trying to describe. In everything there is a certain one to which that thing is reduced, right? The thing that's common among all the dogs that allows me to say they're all dogs. We can all reduce them and all their differences down to this commonality. He says, and this universe is reduced into a one prior to itself. Perfectly simple and one. It's amazing, right? Because we believe that today in modern science, that the universe began with a singularity. And this is what Plotinus says. The universe is reduced to a one prior to itself. Perfectly and simply one. And the one, the principle, fountain, and power of reality, is no one of the natures of which it is the principle. It is such that nothing can be predicated of its nature. Nothing can come before the one. It is the foundation. It is the basis for all form, for all multiplicity. It is that which is needed for anything else to exist. The ultimate abstraction, you might say. Plotinus says, all beings are beings through the one. Unless the one is present with them, will not have an existence. Essence, being, and the one are the same. He who discovers being will also discover the one, and will find that essence itself is the one itself. And then I'll wrap this section up here with Proclus, who says, that beyond which there is nothing is God. So if you trace forms all the way back, you're going to end up in the formless thing from which the forms flow. So when you get beyond where there is nothing, the place that you find yourself in is God, the unity, the one. Okay, that brings me to my next section. Along the same lines, this is the post hoc rationalizations for the mystical intuition. This section I'm going to call one comes before two always. This is sort of a logical argument, but it's really important and it's emphasized by all these guys. So let's start with Plotinus. He says, multitude is always posterior to the one. The many always come after the one. That's what he's saying. Like, as a matter of logic, it must be this way. And Porphyry echoes the same sentiment. He says, prior to the many, it is necessary that there should be the one. Okay, and we understand that. It's like there has to be something to generate, create, or give birth to something else. You got to start with one, that one first cell has to divide to become two, something like that. You're always starting somewhere, okay? He says, it is necessary that there should be something which is sufficient to itself. The one alone is a thing of such a kind, for it does not seek after anything in order that it may be. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. There's a little more than that. So this really ties right back to the foundation argument we were making before. And this kind of says it better than any of the other quotes. It is necessary that there should be something which is sufficient to itself. Something that doesn't need anything else for its existence. There must be something eternal, uncreated, or self-created. There has to be something that doesn't need something else. Otherwise, nothing would exist, right? If you don't have something first that isn't relying on anything else for its existence, then you have nothing, and you will never have anything. You have to have that thing which exists by itself for itself. That it doesn't rely on anything else for its existence. That is the foundation that must come first. That is the one. Something that needs no cause or creator. Right? Then he goes on, he says, there is not likewise any place for it, for it is not in want of a foundation. But other things are established on account of the one, through which they subsist and have the place in which they are arranged. What is he saying here? He's saying that the one, there is no place for the one to exist, because the one is everything. And that would include place, wouldn't it? The one is everything. So that would include a place for it to exist. It itself already is that thing. There is no place for the one to exist. And that's how, this is the reason why, this is, oh boy, I don't want to get on off the path here, but this is the reason that atheists, I think the most compelling reason for atheists to be atheists. Because in their mind, there is no place for God to exist. All right, so God needs no place to be. It is its own place. It's self-contained and self-sustaining, self-sufficient. That's the idea of God as the foundation of things. And he says as much, for it is not in want of a foundation. It is its own foundation. But other things are established on account of the one and subsist and have their place in the one. Everything else exists in the one. The one is the place where everything exists. Like within the one is the cosmos. Of course it must be, because the one is everything. How could it not include the cosmos? But there must be something that needs no cause or creator. There must be a foundation or nothing can be built. And you look around and you see a lot of things exist. A lot of things have been built. There must be a foundation, right? He says, it is wonderful how the multitude of life should originate from non-multitude, and how it is impossible that multitude should exist unless prior something which is not multitude subsisted. Nor again does that which is generated proceed into being from that which is in every respect not. But there is a mutation from one form into another. So I know that's dense, but listen to what he's saying here. We're kind of moving away from this foundation of reality, and instead we're talking along the same lines about the foundations of biology, about life. He said, it is wonderful how the multitude of life, all the different things that exist in all their multiplicity, should originate from non-multitude, from one. We know this is the case, right? This well, I don't know if I could say we know, but our best scientific theory suggests there was a single-celled organism. That was the first thing that managed to, become alive. And from there, it split and became everything that is alive now and ever will. And this is what he says. Listen to this argument that sounds like Darwinian evolution here. He says, nor again does that which is generated proceed into being from that which in every respect is not, but there is a mutation from one form into another. So just like the foundation of being, this oneness we've been talking about, there's a single origin or foundation of life. And all life is just mutations and extensions of that original unity. So reality, being, and life itself mirror each other in this way. They all roll back to one origin and starting place, one single foundation. But this is different ways of the one expressing itself, let's say. Now, Proclus, I mentioned he has something to say here, and I want to tell you, but Proclus is dense and difficult to read, so I had to sort of pare this down as best I can, and let me just do my best here. Proclus says, all multitude participates of the one. Right? This is the idea that the one is the foundation, and the many must come from the one. So the existence of the many is what he calls participating in the one. And this, another way of thinking about this in my mind is like God as the one, and emanations from God as individual beings in the world. But ultimately, they're just emanations of God. They participate in the existence, the life, and the being, and the reality of the thing from which they come. So my life and my being and my reality is identical to the life, being, and reality of the one, or of God. So what he's saying is the multiplicity of the world comes from and depends upon a single source. When he says all multitude participates of the one. He goes on, he says, for if it in no respects participates of the one, the whole will not be one whole, but there will be a multitude of infinities. For each of the many will be the whole. These things, however, are impossible. So what he's saying is that logically, there must be one whole. There must be one reality, one cosmos, right? Everything, there must be a unity of reality, of existence. If there were multiple versions of that, like you might think of what was the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics? What do they call that? Like parallel universes or whatever. You might think of other ideas like this, but Proclus says no. The whole by definition, has to be everything. It has to be the whole. There can't be many wholes, or else there isn't a whole at all. There's many things. We have to get to what the wholeness is. Get our arms wrapped around everything. What is the wholeness? There has to be one of those by definition. He says, for each of the many will be otherwise each of the many will be the whole, and these things are impossible. Later, in different places, Proclus talks about kind of a logical problem of a reductio ad absurdum, where I'm trying how to say this. What he said, one of the quotes that I found somewhere in this, he says something like, this would take place to infinity, there being no one at itself at which it's possible to stop. Like, this is the idea of these multiple wholes or multiple infinities. Proclus sees that as like a logical problem. That if you run into this idea of infinities, that you can't wrap your head, even logically wrap your head around. If you can't find a whole, there's something wrong, right? There's a logical problem here. So Proclus is very like that. He's very mathematical and logical. So he's coming at this from that perspective. And then he says, all beings proceed from one first cause. And that just says it all, right? That's the foundation. Whether we're talking about being, whether we're talking about life, there must be an origin, there must be a starting place, and this is the one. And that brings me to the next section, which is short, but in this section, they're really focusing on matter. So I'm going to call this section matter, argument from substance. This is still a part of that, ad hoc rationalizations, but he's going to talk about matter. So let me just dive in here. He says, nature is not endued with hands and feet, nor any instrument, but matter in which she operates, and which she reduces into form. So nature operates through matter, okay? He says, all those who have spoken concerning matter unanimously assert that it is a certain subject and a receptacle of forms. They dissent, however, from each other in what this subject nature is. Let me just stop and explain this to you, because this literally blew the top off of my head when I first read it. what Plotinus is saying is that matter, everyone agrees, right? He says everyone who speaks about this unanimously agrees that matter is a subject and a receptacle of forms. When he says matter is a subject and a receptacle of forms, what he means is, what were we talking about earlier about being a subject, being conscious? He's saying that all matter is conscious, it's a subject, and it's a receptacle of forms. That's the thing that makes it a particular thing, the form, right? So matter can accept a form to become something specific. Right? A stem cell becomes a blood cell, or a set of coded DNA becomes a being, right? Matter is a subject and an object. Isn't that interesting? This is the idea of panpsychism or idealism. This is a sophisticated philosophical idea that we see everywhere mystical experience can be found, and we see it here too. Matter is conscious. It's amazing. He says, the only thing we argue about is what that subject is. Matter is a subject, but people can't agree on what that subject is. Who is the subject? The I-ness that illuminates or animates the embodied form. And the question that's sort of built into this is, could it be the same subject in all matter, in all form? Is it the same I in all cases? Is that the one? He goes on, he says, there is one matter which is spread under the elements. The many are in one matter of which they are forms. Okay, so matter takes different forms, but it's all one thing. Matter is one, just like being is one, just like life is one. You see what I mean? Everything rolls back to oneness, to unity. And matter, and we believe this, right? We believe that matter is energy, and elements are just different arrangements of that energy. That's what we believe, in modern science. And that's what Plotinus told us. So all the elements are forms of the same thing, this unity. And then lastly, he says, whence does matter proceed? Where does matter come from, right? He said, if it was generated by something. But if it is eternal, first natures will have a causal subsistence. So what is he actually saying here? He's like, where does matter come from? If it was created, If it was created, then it must have come from something capable of creating it, right? If it was created, it comes from a single origin. It comes from God. But if it is eternal, it says it has a causal subsistence. And what that means is it's a self-creating, self-sustaining process of cause and effect. And if that's the case, that process is still a single origin. And I love that idea, by the way. That's basically the idea that Alfred North Whitehead ran with his idea of process philosophy or process theology. That God could be thought of as a process. But whether it's a deity or a process, it's still a single origin, a oneness. You see what I mean? And so those are the arguments, the intuition that comes from mystical experience, and some of these ad hoc justifications, but you see the logic in them. You see why it would help you to make sense of this crazy experience you had that told you were one with the universe. Sorry, I'm checking the time here, guys. All right, so that brings me to the last section before we get to my conclusion. This was, in a sense, a bunch of good stuff that I didn't want to get rid of. I wanted to bring to you. It didn't exactly fit into the rest of the conversation, but I do like the way it ended up. So I'm going to call this last section Mystical Insights. What is the monad? So what are the intuitions that you take back with you from a mystical experience? And you're thinking about it after the fact. You've had this, crazy numinous experience you can't describe, you can't put into words. You're stewing on it. And the more you stew on it, the more things start to fall into place and start to make sense. And you start to kind of fill out the gaps and wrap your head around this experience. And then there are insights. There are things that people say that they come to understand about this idea of God, this sort of ununderstandable concept. So let me just run through some of this with you. Plotinus says, energy proceeds from contemplation. The soul of the world contemplates, and that which she contemplates generates, and thus contemplation begets contemplation. So there's a lot more here, but let's just hone in on some of this. Energy proceeds from contemplation. So we all know, at least in the modern perspective, that all of material reality is made of energy, quantum fields and excitations of energy. And what Plotinus is saying is that energy is contemplation. It's thinking, right? It's something to do with the mind. And then he says the soul of the world contemplates. Okay, so this is the mind we're talking about. The mind that's associated with the soul of the world. And that which the soul of the world contemplates generates, right? So you think about something and it's real, and this is something that idealist philosophers talk about. Imagine that space is sort of the material space we think of when we think of outer space and the space in which we exist is identical to the imaginative space in your mind. But in the case of the cosmos, it's not your mind, but God's mind. And the ideas, the forms, right? Plato calls them both. The things that exist in the mind of God are you and me and the laws of physics and everything else. This is what Plotinus is saying. The soul of the world contemplates, and that which she contemplates generates. And thus contemplation begets contemplation. Now remember, if this space that I exist in, that we exist in, is the mind of God, and you and I are thoughts in that mind, and we can think in our own minds, you get this fractal picture that shows up. We're doing in our contemplation exactly what God is doing in his contemplation that generated us. And what do? We generate our own ideas. And just like we're an idea in the mind of God. So you have this fractal picture which is created. And I think that's appropriate. And I think that's a common theme in mystical intuition. And so what he's saying here is something like all things come from the mind of God. This is what Plato called nous. And also from the order which flows from the mind of God, which Plato would call logos. He goes on, he says, does nature operate from contemplation? And he answers that question, from contemplation entirely. Then he says, nature is only the image of another's contemplation. Right? So it's not, so we're abstract, we have to abstract even beyond nature if we're trying to find this nous or this mind of God. The operations of nature are just an image of the contemplation of the mind of God. He says, hence, all things derive their being from contemplation and are contemplations. See what I mean? All things that exist, you and I included, we are contemplations, thoughts in the mind of God. Okay, so whose or what's contemplation is it? What can we know about this thing? Does Plotinus give us an answer? You betcha. He says, an undecaying intellect presides over this intelligible world. That's whose contemplation. An undecaying intellect, an eternal mind that presides over the intelligible world. This is the Platonic nous. This is the idea of idealism, An undecaying intellect, the mind of God. He goes on, he says, being subsists through becoming the object of intellectual perception, imparting to it existence. Let me just stop. There's more, but holy shit. Let me stop for just a second. What did he just say? Being subsists through becoming the object of perception, imparting to it existence. You remember we were talking about quantum physics earlier? Listen to this. This is right in the same vein. It requires perception. Existence requires perception. That's what he's saying. That's the observer effect. That's the collapsing of the wave function, right? Being subsists through becoming the object of perception. So a subject perceives an object. and something about the perception makes the object real. That's the wave function collapse idea in quantum physics to a T. There's a role in consciousness. And of course there is. Why shouldn't there be? We're talking about the mind of God, aren't we? He goes on, he says, there is, however, a cause of both at once. For these are consubsistent. They go together, being and intellect. He says, being too, this one thing is at once intellect and being. It is intellect so far as it is intellective. So that, I think he means by that, it's intellect so far as it's a subject, but being so far as it's the object of perception. Subject and object at once. Creator and creation at once. This is the oneness that we're after. And I can send this home with a couple of quotes that follow here. Plotinus says, the perceiver and the thing perceived both are one, though it is bold to assert this, he says. It sure is, man. And Proclus says, that which knows and that which is known are one. Right? And Plotinus also says, intellect requires both intellect and intelligible, right? Subject and object. And is therefore at the same time two. If that which is first is not intellect, what can it be? That from which intellect and intelligible proceeds, the thing from which intellect, subject, and object come. Right? The union of opposites, the Ouroboros. This is that mythological idea of the union of opposites. The one thing from which opposites come, the intellect and the intelligible, the subject and the object. He says, we should say that he is the good itself. That thing, right? The union of opposites, that is the good itself. That is the one. He says, in the most simple of all things, the source of life, the origin of intellect and of all things. That is the union of opposites. He says, the most pure intellect originates from the first principle. And being now generated, it generates beings, ideas, and the gods. Being likewise full of the things which it generates, contains them in itself. The mysteries and the fables about the gods say that Saturn, the most wise god, was born prior to Jupiter, and that he contains the things which he generates in himself. All right, so this is the idea of God being the one, and so all things exist within God. And what he's hearkening back to, is this myth that they would be familiar with as ancient Greeks, the myth that Kronos, the Titan, after he starts making babies with Rhea, I believe. When he starts having children with her, he's afraid. Remember in the story, he's afraid that one of these children is going to usurp him. So what does he do? As his children are born, he just swallows them. He swallows them. So all of the gods, all of the forces, all of the things that are being born and generated by these primordial gods, they're kept, they're maintained within the god, right? In this case, by swallowing them. So that they're one thing, right? All these other gods are within Kronos. They're within Saturn. And we've heard this before. This is familiar. We can go way back before the ancient Greeks to ancient Sumeria. And in one of our earliest myths in the world that survives, we have these primordial gods, Tiamat and Apsu. And they're opposites, right? The feminine goddess Tiamat, the masculine god Apsu. Tiamat is the salt water, Apsu is the fresh water. They're opposites in every way. But in the beginning, they're in a sexual embrace. They're unified. They're one thing. That's the Ouroboros, the union of these opposites. And it's a generative, creative union, like sex is, right? So these gods are together, these opposites are together, in this primordial oneness, this primordial unity, like we've been talking about this whole time. And while they're together, they're giving birth to all the gods and all the natural forces and all the things that are going to become the universe. But you see, they're not separated yet. So all these things are being born in them, within them, inside of them. This is the idea of Kronos swallowing all the other gods, keeping them inside themselves. This is the idea of God as the one, and all things exist within it, if you understand. I just also want to add that there is a Greek version of this Tiamat and Apsu story, so we don't have to limit this to Kronos swallowing the Olympians. They have a primordial version, just like Tiamat and Apsu. It's Ouranos and Gaia, heaven and earth. Like those were the original titans. So you have all these levels of parallels in these myths. And that brings me to my conclusion. So what I most hope to illustrate here, apart from the legacy of monism, which the Greeks had in common with and perhaps even foreshadowed in the development of monotheistic Christianity, is the Neoplatonic description of the one as the Ouroboros, or paradoxical union of opposites. It occurs to me that the idea of the union of opposites is in fact a clever symbolic expression of the one. It is one in a way that no other thing is or ever could be. It is the thing which is so perfectly complete and self-sufficient that it includes its own negation, its own opposite. It is the union of, say, masculine and feminine, of the transcendent and the immanent, of being and becoming. It encompasses all possible things, and so is the all, the one, the wholeness, God itself. The particular ways in which the Neoplatonists chose to describe the Ouroboros, I think, reveals much. Paramount among them is this telltale sign of mystical experience. When Plotinus says the perceiver and the thing perceived both are one, he's choosing a set of opposites that are uniquely non-physical, non-material. They refer to consciousness, which is ethereal, numinous, and spiritual. It's not physical, right? Even so, consciousness does encompass the material world, right? That which we experience. That's the material world. As well as the feeling that we have of being the subject of consciousness. See, this approach leaves nothing unaccounted. It subsumes all. And we hear echoes of this from Porphyry too, who describes the one as, quote, the union of that which knows with that which is known. And Proclus, who said, that which knows and that which is known are one. So we touched on one of the oldest expressions of the Ouroboros earlier, the primordial union of Tiamat and Apsu from ancient Sumeria, and hints of it surviving in the classical Greek myth of the primordial titan keeping its offspring within itself by swallowing them. But as time went on and philosophers stewed on the deepest meaning of their myths, they came to understand the Ouroboros in new ways, ever more comprehensible, ever more consciously understood, less mythological, and ever more metaphysical. Okay, listen to Porphyry's attempt to describe the paradoxical union of opposites as the foundation of reality. And listen for the paradox. Listen to this. Porphyry says, nothing incorporeal has any locality. Things incorporeal are everywhere. God is everywhere because he is nowhere. God indeed is everywhere and nowhere. And as all beings are from and in God, hence he is neither beings nor subsists in them. All things are produced through him and are contained in him because he is everywhere. They are, however, different from him because he is nowhere. The ancients, when they assert that it is one, immediately add that it is likewise all things. When they say that it is everywhere, they add that it is nowhere. When also they assert that it is in all things, they add that it is nowhere in everything. In short, they render it manifest to us through contrary peculiarities, assuming these in order that we may exterminate conceptions derived from bodies which obscure real being. So, to describe this Ouroboros, to describe this high God, this God with a capital G, this monotheistic, sublime principle, the ultimate, whatever you want to call it. To do that, Porphyry says we have to get outside of the conceptions that existing in a body force on us, so that we can see reality as it really is. This harkens back to that ego death experience, which is associated again with mystical enlightenment. So existing embodied obscures reality. It reveals merely a veil, never showing us the truth of itself or of ourselves. But if we can come to understand that which we experience and our capacity for experience are in fact one and the same, then we will know all things as a unity and how it is they can be a unity. We will know this unity as God and stand astonished in the knowledge that we are in God and of God. And as Plotinus said, repose in his solitary deity.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.